There we go. Glenn, we are live.
Hey, Steve. Hey, everybody. Hope,
Hey,
hope we've got a few people listening to us now.
yeah, we have 5 already, and that's honestly more than we normally get exactly at 6 at an actual live meetup in London. So I think this is a big thumbs up so far.
Yeah, brilliant. Welcome to those that have already signed in.
Yeah, welcome. So we're gonna sit here and let people arrive, very much like we would do at a normal meetup, and then come around 1/4 past, maybe a little earlier. We'll start doing our intros. We'll introduce Emil, our speaker for today, and then hopefully somewhere around 1/2 past, we will hand it over. So not bad. Anything else to add, Glenn?
Yeah, so if anyone's watched this in LinkedIn, if you drop a message in the chat, we'll try and pick that up. And if you're watching this on YouTube, again, just drop a message in the chat and or in the comments, and we'll try and pick those messages up. So if you've got any questions for our speaker or for me, Steve, then please just use that.
Yeah, and if you do add a chat on YouTube during Emil's discussion, he can see those and also on LinkedIn. We're monitoring those, so just feel free to ask questions as you're going along, and yeah, it should work out wonderfully. We appreciate your patience, and we will be back shortly.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the DSO London Gathering online remote. If you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. If you're watching this on LinkedIn, we're glad you can make it. Okay, so we should be starting in about 6-7 minutes, about a quarter past. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Emil, our speaker, then please drop them into the YouTube comments or onto the LinkedIn comments, and we can pick them up from there.
Okay.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. Well, hello, Steve.
Hello, Glenn.
It's as if we hadn't been speaking to each other. Okay, so welcome to the DevSecOps London Gathering for our March edition. And we are, obviously, as you can see, we are virtual today. We're not in person. And that's because we have a speaker that is based overseas, and also just gives us a break from traveling to London. So I think, Steve, you're in Toronto right now, right?
That's true. It would be difficult for me.
Yeah, very difficult. So there you go. So here's the format for the evening. So doing our intros right now. So we'll then introduce our speaker, Emil, and then you'll get to listen to a great talk. Now, if you've got any questions as we go through the talk tonight, then please do drop them into the YouTube comment or into the LinkedIn comment, and we'll try and pick them up from there. Yeah, so please do that. So any questions for Steve, myself, or Emil, then just do that. So here's us. Here's me, Steve, and Jess. Jess is in the background somewhere. I think she's checking on some of the questions that have been asked. So if you want to get in hold of any of us, then this is how you do that. Steve, Jess, and I all have Twitter accounts, and we're all on LinkedIn with up-to-date profiles. So please do check us out. We've all got some great stories to tell. If you want to get in touch with the actual the DevSecOps London Gathering, then this is the best way to do it. The best way is using team@dsolg.com via email. We could also go to our website and get some details from there. We're also a meetup, which is how most of you found us. And for those of you watching on LinkedIn, you'll know that we are on LinkedIn. We have a DevSecOps London Gathering meetup page. And of course, those of you watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us. You've obviously found the DevSecOps London Gathering YouTube channel. In addition to the DevSecOps London Gathering, we also have a podcast, the DSO Overflow podcast. Steve, we just recently published about a week ago with previous speakers, and so please do subscribe to the channels. Please give us a rating as well, because obviously we want to spread the news about DevSecOps. So watch or listen to our podcasts, give it a rating and a comment, and do subscribe. Then we're hoping to bring you a special one in very shortly, and so listen out for some announcements about our DevSecOps or DSO Overflow, because we do have a special episode coming up. And we also like to give a shout out to a lot of our sponsors. We are not sponsors, our friends, I should say. Let's leave to the sponsors. So our friends. So we have OWASP London, the chapter Sam Stepnian, who quite often attends their events, and we like to attend his events. OWASP London is a great event if you want to go to somewhere in London to hear about the latest OWASP updates on their projects and so forth. That's a good place to go. We're also like to give a shout out to London DevOps, who we were actually at the offices of one of their sponsors last time, so you can see it's a bit of an insidious type of industry that we're in, and there's a few others there. So We Shape Tech Talks as well. I certainly recommend hearing those out. They've also got some great content going on there. And there's some others there as well. And I'm going to hand over to Steve to talk to you about our sponsors.
Sure. So like platforms, certainly the virtual platforms like what you're watching this on right now and where we're broadcasting from wouldn't be possible if people weren't helping fund all the work that we do. And Systake is one of those sponsors. Systake prioritizes software vulnerabilities, detects and responds to threat, manages cloud configurations, and they have some absolutely killer open source like Falco that you can dive into security for free with. So I highly recommend you go check them out. And our other gold sponsor is Prisma by Palo Alto Networks. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I actually worked here. So a little bit of a, I don't know what you call it, nepotistic sponsorship slightly there. Prisma, the provider of one of the only real, I'd say, cloud-native application protection platforms out there, securing infrastructure, applications, data across hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Lots of links. Check them out. Or you can just Google it. You'll find it. It's everywhere. Okay. We are always looking for speakers. We're booked up till about June right now. We've got a queue of extra people we're trying to have interviews with, like Emil, talented people with great knowledge that they want to share with you. So if you want to do that, email us at team@dsolg.com. We have two different types of talks. We have the big talks, like what Emil's going to be doing today. And occasionally we bring in new speakers or speakers who just, only have a nugget of information. As precious as it is, it only takes maybe 15 to 20 minutes to convey that. And we call those lightning talks. If you've got something small and you want to say, then hook us up, team@dsolg. The only thing we do ask is try not to make it commercial. We don't like to advertise for other people. We want to keep it community focused. Open source is fine. That's the only real restriction on that. But there's still, there's so much to talk about. All right. Check us out. And finally, we've blown through our intros faster than normal. That's okay. If you for some reason you tune in late and you missed the beginning, we're broadcasting and recording this on YouTube. You can go back and watch it there. Like us, subscribe us on YouTube, ring the bell so that you're notified every time we go online. The usual stuff people on YouTube say. But without any further discussion, and we're going to bring Emil in here. I can introduce him here. You can read this. Co-founder of O-Plane, threat modeling SaaS portal for developers, lots of experience in cybersecurity, tons of experience with DevSecOps cultures. But why am I introducing him? That seems ridiculous. Let me just jump up here, remove this from the world, and let's add him to the stream. Emil, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here.
Fantastic. So should we just kick right off, you think? And I know it'll be a bit early, but what do you think, Glenn? He's here. Let's do it.
Yeah, we can do. I was just going to also just mention that next month, April, we are actually going to be back in person in London. We've got a venue, so we're looking forward to seeing you back in London. It's going to be at the Veracode offices, I believe. No, it's going to be at the Investigo offices. It's the Veracode is in May. Investigo offices. But please keep an eye on our channels, and we'll update you. But yeah, back in London in April.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to pop this in. Threat Modeling 2.0 Developers Flavor. And Emil, you already have at least one question that has popped up in the chat. I don't know if you saw it. You might want to start off with that. But yeah, excellent.
Sure. I'll definitely give it a try at least. I think the main reason why I chose the title Threat Modeling 2.0 Developers Flavor is that I'd like to, and I don't think that I'm the only one in this AppSec security community that like to see sort of a change in how we look at threat modeling. And I think that a lot of people are talking nowadays about enabling developers to perform threat modeling and to do it as a design activity rather than traditionally more of a security assessment. So while of course there are opportunities and power in both, I'm going to be talking primarily about scaling threat modeling, and the way I see it, the best way to scale it is by enabling developers to perform threat modeling. So my talk is going to be more or less only about that. And threat modeling has been one of my greatest passions for many years. I did threat modeling before I even called it threat modeling. And I think I have that also in common with other people that think this is a great activity to do as part of development. So, but I can start by saying a few words about my background, and maybe it's no surprise that I started as a software engineer, and I think that has affected my perspective to security in many different ways. After some years as a software engineer with a lot of different technology platforms, and I think my latest full-time project as a software engineer was enabling PlayStation 1 titles on Android devices. So more or less emulation of the PlayStation 1 hardware. And that was one thing that I found extremely interesting. But then jumped over to security consultants, and I was with a Nordic security company called TrueSec for many years. I worked there as a penetration tester, code reviewer, did some security research. I found a couple of CVs in Mac OS X. Back then, it was probably wasn't that difficult as it might be today. So, but anyways, that's something that fun to mention. I also worked with electronic signatures and electronic ID platforms as a security software engineer. Became a deputy CEO of TrueSec, and then back to the roots, becoming a security consultant again, and now the startup founder together with my colleague Oscar at Oaklane. Yeah, so that's it regarding my background. And again, you'll probably see how this is reflected in my view of threat modeling and more in the rest of the presentation. And this might seem as a bit of a surprise to some of you, like, but the way I see it, like the best way to scale and perform as detailed threat modeling as possible, close to the context of the development teams, is that the developers do the majority of the threat modeling in a similar manner as we've seen with other AppSec and DevSecOps activities and tooling. And so I think that if you're doing threat modeling for one reason or the other as a security assessment, please stop. And I'm not saying please stop threat modeling, so don't get me wrong. I think rather the opposite. Continue doing threat modeling, and I also think you should continue doing threat modeling the way you are, but I think it's a lot better if you do it together with developers and empower the developers to eventually perform this independently. And again, I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means. But before we dig into that, I think it's worth mentioning even if it might seem obvious, the massive workload increase that we've seen in developers teams lately. This has taken a while. I think the biggest first transition was when architecture and testing became part of development teams' activities with the growth of agile principles, and the rest with operations, primarily through DevOps and cloud-native deployments, but also security as a consequence of that. That there's very little benefit in doing security on the side, and it's actually quite difficult to do security on the side when developers are continuously changing the system landscape. And maybe we haven't seen that full transition yet, but I think that we will see a lot more compliance activities being done as part of the development team activities as well. One significant example of that, at least in the EU, is the EU Red Delegated Act for wireless equipment in consumer IoT products, where it will more or less be impossible to sell products if you don't comply to certain requirements. And complying to requirements that you in an agile world, that usually means that you need to integrate this as part of the development process one way or another. So if we think about this, that the workload has transitioned into being a part of the development work, it's also interesting to reflect on why these transitions happen. And I think that a lot of the reasons can be tied to accuracy, context, and efficiency. That it's to a large degree that we see DevOps as sort of becoming the norm, is that it's a lot more efficient if it's done that way nowadays. It's a lot better context in the teams performing the activities, and it's also accurate and easier to quickly understand when there is a problem, what the actual problem is. And before we start talking about more security-related stuff, I think it would be interesting to look a little bit at the history of mass production, because what we do in the digital transformation is, to me at least, to a large degree, mass production of software. So I think we have a lot in common with industrialization. And one prominent example is the T-Ford with the first moving assembly line, and this was back in 1914, where the production time was reduced from 12 hours to actually 1.5 hours, which is quite interesting by that time. So they cut roughly 88% of the production time in total just by introducing this moving assembly line. So why is that interesting in a cybersecurity context or in security in development? Well, I think it's important to think about this to optimize and make things as efficient as possible. Because if we make things efficient for developers, then we make it a lot more interesting and we make it less boring. Because the worst thing we can do is occupy people's time with time-consuming activities that they feel make very little sense. As a comparison, today we have Tesla Shanghai plant that produces 90 Model Y units every hour. So that's roughly every 40 seconds they're spitting out a new car. And in general, with industry optimizations, I think it's to a large degree about parts and manufacturing of parts, to be more precise. That can be sort of related to open source and reuse libraries within an R&D organization, but also platforms where parts are combined into standardized platforms. That's also a way to make things more efficient. Another aspect is, which was actually used in the optimization of the production time of T4, was to reduce the amount of options. And but finally, maybe the most significant thing is the introduction of machines that could either support humans in their activities or machines working completely independent of humans controlling them. I think maybe we have a question. Okay, maybe we should take it afterwards then. Okay. So let's move on back to cybersecurity. So we often talk about OWASP Top 10 as sort of benchmark, and it's been used for several years as sort of categories of security risks or categories of security vulnerabilities, if you like. But since the beginning of OWASP Top 10, I think that this has become more and more generic as time goes by. And sometimes, even if vulnerabilities or security risks are still quite significant, they drop out of the list because there's other things that are a lot more important. But I took out a subset of the OWASP Top 10, and more specifically 6 categories based on the 10 in total. And I think they are particularly interesting because it's, in my opinion, quite difficult to find good tooling that can do this with sufficient accuracy, with sufficient context, and in an efficient way. And by efficient, I mean counting the total time spent on not only running the tool, but also the activity as a whole. And these examples are, maybe the most obvious is insecure design, but it's quite difficult to identify using an automated tool. Broken access control is, even if some tools claim they can do it, I think the issues with broken access control that I've found in penetration tests and security code reviews and things like that has been difficult to find using automated tooling. And the same or similar with the other issues. So I think the conclusion of this is that context is extremely important. And without context, it's going to be very difficult to identify the majority of the security issues that we see out there today. So I already mentioned this briefly, like what's the approach to take, or what's the most efficient or accurate. And looking at, for instance, static application security testing or static analysis, then it's obviously difficult to identify issues like broken access control and things like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that the tools are able to identify one type of issue that can be seen as a broken access control issue, but that's something different in my opinion. So it's all about coverage, and if we can only, like, I think it doesn't really count if a tool is able to identify one type of issue within one of the categories. I think it has to have significantly higher coverage than that. Same goes with dynamic application security testing. That's just banging on a black box. It doesn't really have any context knowledge. And even if we were to trim that into having context, then it's still difficult, because nowadays most of the web systems or web applications that we see requires authentication, and then you need more or less to have authentication performed for the tool before you can continue the analysis. And some of these tools can be set into a more active or passive mode, but regardless, like if you use it in an active mode, then you basically gonna most likely gonna destroy some data. So you have to have a separate testing environment, and still you need context to perform sufficient coverage of the API, of running the APIs and such. Software composition analysis doesn't really count in this area, because it's actually just covering one category that wasn't mentioned in my previous list, the A6 with vulnerable and outdated dependencies, or vulnerable and outdated components to be precise. So I think that, I'm not saying that threat modeling will cover everything, but I think that if you do threat modeling in a developer context, then it's definitely possible to identify all of these 6 categories at least, and probably a lot more depending on how you do it. And again, measure the entire activity in terms of how much time it consumes and how much coverage it gets. Not only running the tool, because sometimes you might get misled by the fact that the static analysis tools run by itself in a pipeline, and it doesn't really require any human brain on it. But I think it's rather the opposite, that it occupies quite a lot of time among developers, regardless if you do it passively on the side and triage sort of in bulk, or if you run it with policy configuration and basically prevent merging of pull requests and things like that. So static analysis is quite intrusive in most development teams that I've met, at least. But this also depends a lot on the configuration. So if you can narrow it down to cover, let's say, a certain category of vulnerabilities that you believe the tool is quite accurate at, and that you have seen that in many different instances of the project before, then of course it makes sense to have static analysis. But again, for the list of vulnerability categories that we saw here, it doesn't really make sense. And again, threat modeling isn't the only thing that's relevant for a development team. And by development team, I mean regardless if it's in a larger enterprise, delivering a microservice that's part of a larger business process, or if it's a startup that are building their very first platform. And I think that's one of the issues we have today, and it also relates to the workload increase of development teams, or the responsibility of DevOps teams today. So even if you're a startup, and let's say that you're a startup delivering to the automotive industry today, then you need to consider, even at an early stage of your company growth, you need to consider detection and response, disaster recovery plans, and automated security testing in one way or another, and most likely code review and gap analysis to understand if you actually have sufficient quality of your security implementation. But with all these activities or artifacts, if you like, that needs to be produced, I think threat modeling is still a good place to start and a good way of identifying the need of supplementary activities. So we could turn it the other way around. If we look at detection and response, for example, it would be extremely difficult in most cloud-native deployments, for instance, to identify applicable detection and response mechanisms without understanding what's the context, how does the data flow look in this particular application, what potential anomalies are we interested in. And potential anomalies can also be based on what type of countermeasures that we have implemented for a specific threat identified. So we might be able to bring the likelihood of an event to happen down by implementing a mitigation, but we might still be interested in having logging and monitoring so that we can detect when there is an anomaly. And detection of an event or a potential anomaly is crucial to hinder a more significant security breach at the right time. So, and this is also something, if we take a step aside from threat modeling for a while, if we look at cybersecurity as a whole, and for instance with SOC, Security Operations Centers, a lot of organizations are struggling with this today to integrate monitoring, detection and response and logging and monitoring of the application workloads, especially cloud-native application workloads, into the SOC. So most SOCs have quite good coverage, at least in the enterprise, have quite good coverage of desktop environments, servers, and Active Directory and all that, sort of the back office systems, but they still are lagging behind with monitoring of applications. So there's a big opportunity in scaling threat modeling to better understand what detection and response mechanisms we need out there. So going back to threat models, and you probably have heard about the 5 steps of threat modeling, which is basically what is it that we are building, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good job? And this is more or less similar to the way I illustrated here, but I tried to keep it a little bit simpler to say that it's about creating a system model, and it's about analyzing that system model and dealing with the outcome of that analysis. But this basically means the same thing as the traditional steps. The reason I like to put it this way is that I think these are the 3 main foundational building blocks that also strictly depend on each other, which means that a crappy, to be precise, system model will need to a crappy analysis, and the outcome will not be that good either, of course. But also the opposite. If we spend efforts on creating an accurate system model, still in an efficient way, of course, so that's a major challenge, then we have opportunities to not only perform a good analysis, but also opportunities to automate to a certain degree. But this depends on the format of the system model. And note that I say system model and not necessarily diagram. diagrams are, in my opinion, one way of visualizing a system model or structuring a system model, but it doesn't necessarily mean that diagrams and models are the same thing. But the most important is that the system model doesn't only contain what different building blocks we have and how they are connected to each other, but also what does the data flow look like. And now we're talking at a business process level or use case level, if you like. So, and this is actually quite easy to introduce in development teams, and developers think that developers think that this is probably the easiest things with threat modeling for them. So it's quite convenient for them to get familiar with the system model part. And analysis is a bit more difficult because that requires some experience in threat modeling. So the very first time, this will take some time. And later on, even if you have spent a lot of time on producing your first threat model, it's going to be a lot easier when you do it iteratively. So as you have a threat model as a starting point, you have a system model that shows the system composition and the existing data flows. And then if you are only about to extend that with a delta based on a certain new feature that the team is about to implement, then the threat modeling can be a lot smaller, and sometimes you can do threat modeling of a new feature within 30 minutes or so. But metrics in general is really important about that. And I'm going to talk more about metrics later on in the presentation. I think that metrics can be used to drive the behavior we'd like to see out there. And we shouldn't only focus about metrics on the outcome, but metrics on the total, like including if we have new features coming into the team, then that's also relevant to include as part of the metrics, because otherwise we won't know to what degree we have coverage of our threat modeling. So how do we scale this in an efficient manner? First of all, I think it's what I usually recommend to not focus that much on perfection. Like if you teach someone to do a new thing that they haven't done before, then we couldn't strive for perfection, and we shouldn't. We should remind ourselves not to jump in and try to overanalyze the problem and try to identify all possible security threats. It's fine to push that aside and gradually improve the threat model later on. And I think that changes this perspective on threat modeling to many people, if you put it that way. That it doesn't necessarily only have to be a one-time activity, but rather an artifact that can be updated and enriched with more information later on. And in terms of accuracy, if people start to do threat modeling more or less independently, or at least make an attempt to do so, then reviewing the threat models is a great way of improving the accuracy. This also depends a little bit on the formats of the model. If you have a more stringent model format, then you increase the opportunities of having a more accurate format or a more accurate model. And also the other way around, if you, let's say that you set that diagrams are more or less equal to models, and you say to your teams that you can create whatever diagram you prefer, then the challenges with accuracy becomes a lot higher, because then you need to consider like what they have missed in the model, and then it's going to be a lot more difficult. But again, with context, we don't necessarily have to cover everything. And if we're talking about use cases, it's completely fine to have just threat model 1 or 2 key use cases. After all, in that piece of application, then that's probably covering most of the issues or significant issues that the opportunistic attackers might attempt. Because opportunistic attackers often make attempts to attack an application based on the existing use case flows by just trying the application out and maybe manipulating certain pieces of the data flow when doing so. And we need to keep in mind again that this is going to take some time to learn, but it's also going to be a lot faster next time, especially if you only threat model the delta, or let's say that you add an additional use case of your existing functionality to the threat model. Tooling can streamline the activity a lot, but tooling isn't the only thing that matters. I think we should put a lot more emphasis on the collaboration. Of course, we as security professionals, we can guide the teams a lot, but we should remind ourselves of avoiding to become the hero threat modeler. Because some developers feel that's a lot more comfortable that someone that's experienced in the field does it, but keep in mind that this won't scale in the long term. Excuse me. So system models, if we drill into that a little bit deeper, it's two different angles that I think is important to highlight here. One is producing the system models. And of course, it's tempting to see that it's probably possible to have them automatically created. And that's of course possible. You can, for instance, with if you're running in AWS or Google Cloud or Azure or whatever, you can almost dump your exact architecture or what different components at least that you have within your cloud workload. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have an accurate model of your system. So typically when you automatically extract stuff through an API like that, and that goes for Kubernetes and anything as well, they often typically miss that you have external dependencies to other systems, because that lies in the application logic rather than in the cloud configuration. Template-based is another alternative, and I think that has worked quite well where I've seen it. If you have templates, like let's say that you have a typical application deployed in AWS, and there are like 50 teams within the company that have similar deployments or that look very much alike, then of course it makes sense to create a template so that they can faster produce the first system model. And creating system models as code, for instance, with diagrams as code through CloudQML or Mermaid or tools like that, then that's of course also an option. But I think they share the same challenges as any other diagramming formats, that it's a challenge to keep these diagrams in a unified format and having a sufficient level of detail. So speaking about formats, I have used data flow diagrams before. I've used C4 diagrams quite a lot. You should check out c4model.com if you haven't heard about C4 before. It's more or less about 4 different abstraction levels of architecture diagrams. And C4 is gaining a lot of attention nowadays within software teams. So C4 is really good, and this is an example of a C4 system context diagram that I showed in the picture. And depending on how detailed you produce your C4 diagrams, they can, if you do it, if you spend a lot of time, and if you have a unified way of identifying what objects to include in your C4 diagram, then you will get quite good coverage of your analysis. One example, or most obvious examples, is that at least 95% or above of the threat models I do on web systems today have one or another identity provider. Sometimes they have two identity providers depending on what type of users that are logging in. In this diagram examples, we have both Azure AD and Keycloak. So Keycloak is used for the customers and Azure AD for the corporate users logging in. So, but that's also a good example of where it makes sense to have formats optimized for threat modeling. If we know that an identity provider is always interesting to the threat model itself, because it's a significant part of authentication and sometimes for authorization as well, then we probably want to ensure that it ends up in the model one way or another. So that's an example where it makes sense to have a more stringent format. I didn't talk about sequence diagrams. Some teams use that. I think it's a bit messy to have that as a collaborative model because for some people it's quite easy to follow sequence diagrams, but the majority have difficulties in overseeing the total system landscape, including what dependencies that are external and what components that are part of this software system. So in my opinion, at least, data flow diagrams and C4 diagrams are a lot easier to follow for people that are, especially for people that are new to threat modeling. And as far as it goes for the analysis, I think that one useful way to get going with the analysis, and especially if you're new to threat modeling, is to use a threat library. But keep in mind that overdoing threat libraries can easily lead to more of an assessment approach to threat modeling, which is really not what we want to see. We should have emphasis on collaboration and emphasis on the context analysis. Threat libraries by nature don't have any context, but still it can be useful as a starting point, and people can learn about how does a threat look, and to start thinking about the format of a threat and the format of a countermeasure. And that would make them more comfortable in writing their own context-specific threats and so forth. So, and of course, there are still issues that are, even if it's coupled with a context, it's generic in one way or another. For instance, if we are using a cookie to store the authentication token or access token, then there are certain threats that apply to all applications that are using cookies. With regards to context, I mentioned earlier that I think context should follow the use cases. That's the easiest way to start, and I don't see any other efficient alternative than following the existing use cases of the application. Again, it doesn't have to be all the use cases. The important thing is to start with a use case or a feature, if you like, to analyze the data flow of that and identify what would a threat actor try to do in the same context. And last but not least, to prioritize, because it won't be possible to solve everything. And we usually recommend to prioritize based on impact, or set a severity of a threat based on impact. And then people might be surprised when they hear that, or at least I've gotten that feedback before, because usually we talk about impact and likelihood of an event to happen, or a risk, if you like. But in my opinion, especially for people that are new to security, it's quite difficult to judge the likelihood of an event to happen. And it's on the opposite, it's quite easy to misjudge the likelihood, so that you accidentally down prioritize an issue that's quite significant. So for simplicity, reasons, I think severity should be primarily based on the impact of an event. And the third part, the outcome, is to deal with the countermeasures that we have identified tied to the threats that we identified in the threat model. And I think, and I think most of you agree that the outcome should be land as tickets in the issue tracking system of the team. But in my experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that the issues get implemented just because it landed in the system as tickets. I think this also depends on how accurately you describe the definition of done and how you describe what to implement, and of course how to test it as well. I also think it depends on how you present it to stakeholders, and both in what format and in terms of descriptions. Let's say that you have a product owner or an engineering manager that should care about the results of the analysis and reflect on that, or even C-level. Then in order to do so, they need the data in a format that suits them. And that can depend a lot on what type of stakeholder it is. Some people care about progress. Are we doing threat modeling? Are we mitigating the issues that we identified? While other people care more about what's the aggregate amount in total compared to last month. And sometimes it's also often that systems are combined into a business process or broader solution. And if you're responsible for that solution as a whole, then you're probably interested in the aggregate of security findings in order to make a qualified decision on a go-no-go decision for an official launch of that business process or application, for example. So metrics should be used to drive the progress and drive the behaviors we'd like to see in the organization. And as an example, it's to me a lot more important to see, has threat modeling been performed at all? Have they done anything about the issues, rather than the amount of critical and high findings that they have identified, because that will anyway change over time. But if the pulse isn't beating, then at least for us that are helping the company to scale their security program, then we need to care about that, because that can have many different reasons. Like, for instance, if issues are just being kept in the issue tracking system and never dealt with in, let's say, 6 months or so, then that usually indicates that there's either a problem with the priority in the team as a whole, or that the developers or the stakeholders don't understand how to solve the ticket. And then it bounces back to the threat modeling analysis, where you identify what to do as security implementation. So keep in mind when writing issues that it's not only about writing an issue that thou shall implement TLS or something like that. The more accurate you describe how to implement it and how to test it and what you expect from that implementation, then the more likely it is to have it implemented by the team. And of course also describing what the risks are with leaving it without implementation. And I think that's something that we should expect in general, not only for threat modeling, of course, but in general with issues identified. We need to live with the fact that no one will bring it down to zero. And if they, for some reason, manage to bring it down to zero, then it probably won't stay there for very long. And if it does, that indicates that we are not performing any new analysis. Some of the common pitfalls that I've seen, the most common is that threat modeling is done as a security assessment rather than as a design activity. And I think that is, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I think it's a problem if you want to achieve threat modeling as being a developer's activity. And if you want to have as high cadence as possible and doing threat modeling on changes that are performed in the systems, then we can't see secure threat modeling as being a security assessment. It's going to be extremely important to have it implemented as a design activity instead. And the most obvious when people fall into this trap is that they lose developers' passion about security. So keep that in mind. And if you recognize that you might have fallen into the security assessment trap, try to call back up and do things a little bit different and engage the developers more closely into the threat modeling process. Another thing that's partly related to that is to start, and this is especially relevant in larger organizations, larger enterprises. That is when you start with how to mitigate, rather than starting with a sufficient system model. And this typically happens when organizations are tempted to try to foresee what the common issues are within our organization. And I think that's at least something that I try to remind myself of, to try to avoid predicting what the biggest issue is within a certain system model. And that's based on my experience with threat modeling, and even threat modeling with teams that do this for the very first time. I think that in many of these cases, the developer team members have expressed the most significant threats themselves, sometimes with some guidance by me, but very often also without even me initiating the discussion within that area. And I think that proves that developers know a lot more about what the most severe issues could be in their system model. And they might not call it threat modeling yet, but if we can help them perform such an analysis and document such an analysis in a more structured manner, then we'll get them going with a more systematic threat modeling. So if we try to roll out security requirements, generic security requirements, and try to squeeze them into all development teams by doing threat modeling, then that's not the right approach, in my opinion. I think that developers know the context, developers are able to analyze that context with some training. So keep that in mind as well. Another thing is to not enable developers and security champions to work independently. And of course, this could be seen as more or less the same issue as the previous one, but I think it's slightly different, especially from the perspective that developers and security champions are usually new to security, or a lot of them are new to security. They do security work for the first time. And then people might think that we need to babysit them, but I think that's seldom the case. A lot of people that are at least senior software engineers or senior developers or new as security champions, they want to try things out themselves and they want to try working independently. And it's completely fine for them to do so, and it's actually a beauty in having them doing so. And we need to rely on the fact that we will gain better coverage, better accuracy by reviewing the threat model and supporting them in providing formats that provide sort of guardrails to how to produce the system model. A lot of the things that I've mentioned in this presentation is included in the threat modeling manifesto. It might be using slightly different wording, but it all has the same meaning. It's about establishing a culture of finding and fixing design issues over checkbox compliance. So again, if you see people doing threat modeling or something they call threat modeling, but they're actually doing checkbox compliance, then they are not really following the threat modeling manifesto principles. And of course, it's completely fine to do so, but the main reason for the threat modeling manifesto is to have scaling aspects in mind and to have threat modeling being done broader than it is when it's performed only by security professionals. People and collaboration over processes, methodologies, and tools. And with people and collaboration, at least I mean that it makes sense to collaborate between development organizations and security organizations. So I'm not saying that security people should never be involved in threat modeling. Don't worry, I don't think we'll be out of a job, not until we retire at least. So I think that the power lies in the collaboration. And if people can contribute with their expertise into a collaborative exercise, then it's more likely to be an accurate and efficiently produced threat model. It's a journey of understanding over security or privacy snapshot. And that's a feedback I get a lot when doing threat modeling, both in enterprise context and with startup teams. That people often express that this was one of the greatest exercises we had in several months, because now all of a sudden I joined this company like 6 months ago, but I haven't had a chance to understand the overall view. And threat modeling was, funny as it might seem, the first time that they even understood the overall context and the relationships of their systems, the system that they developed with the rest of the system landscape within the company. And of course, obvious doing threat modeling over talking about it, and continuous refining over a single delivery. And that's really about like the gradually increase of accuracy of the threat model and gradually increasing the coverage. So as an example, to expand the threat model with a new threat category that we encountered, or more likely a new feature that the team is about to develop. There's a lot more to read about this at the Threat Modeling Manifesto. And in terms of scaling aspects and to enable people to do security rather than doing security for them, I recommend also taking a look at the recently launched Security Champions Guidebook at OWASP. And I think that's still quite new, but there are a lot of good things in it worth considering when establishing AppSec at scale, or establishing threat modeling as a foundational activity of secure design. And by that, I'd like to thank you all, and I think we might have a couple of questions.
Okay, amazing, Emil. That was like packed.
Yeah, it was definitely loaded. There are a couple of questions. In fact, one's from Steve, one's from Jessica, and if anyone else has got a question, do please put them into the comments on LinkedIn or in YouTube, and we'll be able to pick them up from there. But Jessica, did you want to ask your question first?
Yeah, we can add Jess back to the stream, seeing as she's rejoined. Hold on. Bing.
Hey everyone, Emil, thanks so much for your talk. Really appreciate it. I guess my question was going to be around the threat libraries, around like how can we avoid over reliance and those kind of subsequent pitfalls that you outlined.
Yeah, I think that it's of course a balance because there are benefits with using a threat library in the first place, but we see at least in some threat modeling tools that are more advanced, they have like different categories of threat models connected to, for instance, certain compliance frameworks, and it's not necessarily the most efficient way to understand if you comply with a certain regulatory framework or not, to perform that as part of the threat modeling. And that's also another thing that I don't know if I mentioned that, but I think that when we see threat models as an artifact and not only a one-time activity, then there's also opportunities to perform other benchmarks or assessments, if you like, by using the threat model. But we should avoid calling that threat modeling, I think, because if we do threat modeling as one type of activity together with the development team, then we can do a lot of other analysis as well by using the threat model. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. And Steve, you had a question as well about the phase, I think, of when to do threat modeling. You're on mute, Steve.
See? Look at that. I'm being a good presenter and muting when I'm not talking, and then forgetting to unmute. Hey, I had a question which I think I threw on LinkedIn to see if it would show up. When the stakeholders, what stakeholders are responsible? That's maybe a loaded question. I'm putting my DevSecOps advocate hat on. Are responsible for the threat modeling phase, because it's not just a one and done kind of activity. And in my experience, in the larger scale cloud and cloud enterprise scenarios, it's kind of essential that the devs, like in ops, all three personas are involved. How do you keep them involved? How do you keep particular developers, because they just don't care half the time? But how do you get them involved and keep them involved, interested in this sort of repeating process of threat modeling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that is, or at least the things I've been successful with when getting involvement, is to stay as close to their context as possible, and not drilling too deep into analysis on a depth level, like to identify all potential threats that could happen. Similar to vulnerability management, it's often an overload for DevOps teams to just see, like, this is the total amount of vulnerabilities you have in your system. But rather, like, gradually and incrementally starting to produce that threat model. And if they see it as a fundamental design activity, then they often find it interesting as well, to understand, like, similar to resilience requirements or to deal with high availability requirements. A lot of engineers find that very interesting, whether it's SREs or if it's developers. So if we can keep it as close to that as possible, but still dealing with security threats, that's, in my opinion, the most optimal.
It's, and to follow up on that, like, it's interesting how I would say, well, maybe vendors and certainly organizations struggle if they buy particular automation tools. Then you've mentioned SaaS tools, these sort of the SCA that exist. I do wonder if you get developers buying into the threat model early. That's almost like a gateway drug to them understanding why certain automation has been applied to their environment, so they're less resistant to the automation and tooling that gets purchased after the fact, hopefully after the fact.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a maturity journey as well. And maybe it hasn't really landed yet what we'll see in terms of automation versus manual work with regards to security or building security by design. And I often hear people question like, why can't we just do threat modeling automatically? Or why can't we just rely on the automated tools? And I think, of course, that would be the ideal situation for most teams if they could. I mean, I don't think they're not interested in finding new things to spend their time on, because they are, again, quite busy with a lot of the things that they already do, and a lot of teams are actually under stress, which is another thing that we need to deal with. But at the same time, so maybe the way I see it, the first wave was with the SaaS and SCA tools being squeezed in many organizations, and now we see a lot of teams questioning the coverage and questioning the accuracy of that, and questioning the efficiency as well, like how much time they need to spend on explaining to the tool why this isn't necessarily a problem, or at least isn't necessarily as severe as the tool claims. And I think the next wave will be something more close to how developers are used to work, and especially with regards to design.
Perfect.
Cool. Since you two have asked a question, I'll probably able to ask a question as well. One thing which many people who do threat modeling have come across is models like Stride. Now, you didn't mention any models like that. What's your why have you deliberately avoided using those types of models?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I must confess that I didn't even consider including it in my presentation, and that's probably because I seldom talk about Stride or Dread or something like that, because I think it's too much security lingo, and it's difficult. I think we have a fundamental problem, or at least a challenge, if we need to start teaching people security lingo before we can engage them into the security activities, and to explain what repudiation means and things like that. So, but of course, Stride is still relevant, and I think a lot of the threats that we identify when doing threat modeling can be connected to one of the words in Stride, of course. But I think you can talk about the same threats by just looking at the use cases and see, what if an attacker does this? Like, what if an attacker manipulates this parameter, and this parameter will get forwarded to another backend system, and eventually becoming something similar to a server-side request forward. So I think that matters a lot more, to think of it as development, as any other development.
Yeah, makes sense. We actually have a question from Usman Khan. He asks, in the manifesto, there is a question, did we do a good enough job? He's asking, do you have any approaches that can help organizations answer this when threat modeling?
Yep, that's an excellent question. I think that sometimes when people hear me talking about threat modeling and that it should be done to the largest degree possible by development teams or security champions, and not necessarily security professionals, then people question, like, how do you know that they get sufficient coverage? How do we know that they don't miss one of the most significant threats? And the answer is we don't. But we can gradually teach them, and we can gradually help them improve the accuracy by performing reviews of the threat models, and security professionals reviewing what people have done. That's an important training aspect. That also means, like, let's say that you're responsible for rolling a threat modeling or software security program at scale. It's also an extremely efficient way to benchmark where are the teams at and where is this individual at in terms of competence development in this area. Another thing regarding understanding if we did a good job is that, and that's actually something that I've used in the past as well, to engage people with a more offensive security background or like penetration test background. So people that the same people that you usually hire to perform a traditional penetration test, and ask them to do a security test or penetration test based on your threat model. Like, help us challenge the breadth and depth and detail, not only of the threat model itself, but also the implementation of the outcome. And the results of that is quite interesting. That to a large degree, and with emphasis on large degree, we proactively covered what they were about to test in the penetration test. So there were still some areas that they identified, or flaws that they identified in the applications, that wasn't necessarily caught, but in the threat model as a whole. But some examples of findings in the actual penetration test report was things that you could connect to an issue that was still in the backlog, or things that you could connect to an issue that got implemented as a result of performing threat modeling, and by getting implemented, I mean it was implemented as set as done, but they might have like covered 8 of 9 in total instances of the problem. So to me, that proves that we can get a good coverage. It won't be perfect, but we will narrow down what we use offensive security expertise for. And if we narrow that down, we get them to focus on the most important stuff rather than kicking in open doors.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm looking at the idea that we can use threat modeling to inform the theories that we produce for security chaos engineering. So it's quite a new concept, security chaos engineering. Have you come across that? And do you think that there's any value in looking at threat modeling as a source of information for the security chaos engineering experiments?
Definitely. I haven't done it a lot. I heard about the people doing it. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I think we actually have many different dialogues about threat modeling being used in other contexts that we didn't foresee, like SOCs that can benefit from threat modeling, for instance, to better understand what their current coverage is, for instance, in terms of detection and response capabilities. So yeah, that's most likely going to work.
Oh, cool. Okay, so Steve, Jess, do you have any more questions? Are there any more questions from the audience, from our listeners?
I just saw a comment show up. Oh yeah, just went that says thanks. All right, there was one from Vivek way back at the beginning. Now I'm scrolling way back. Jess, do you have that in your head?
Yeah, that was what is the difference between developers' flavors versus security engineer flavors in terms of threat modeling?
Yeah, and I tried to answer it partly, at least in the beginning of the presentation. And I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be two different ways of performing threat modeling. I think there are benefits if we as security engineers can see this as being the new way of doing threat modeling. And we can still be closely involved in threat modeling, especially facilitating the first threat models being performed, so that people familiarize with the ways of thinking and ways of performing that. So that's I've tried this in different larger organizations, and it's people usually learn quite fast, like training security champions to become independent in performing threat modeling. So I think, in my opinion, that should be both the developer's flavor and the security flavor.
Nicely done.
Excellent. I think that is the end of our questions, and that is wonderful timing because it is exactly 1/2 the hour.
Cool. Okay. Well, Emil, thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That's been a great. I think we've learned a lot tonight. As you say, it was a packed conversation, and I think our members will like to reflect back on this podcast, on this YouTube channel, and replay this, because I think there's a lot to unpack there. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Excellent.
Pleasure being here.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. And one last thing, I'm just going to throw it up on the screen now. Is there we go. I got that right? I didn't screw up the date. It is April 12th.
Yeah, April 12th. Yeah, because
all right, 6 p.m. Venue Investigo, 10 Bishop Square in London, and our speaker, roughly confirmed, is Mackenzie Jackson from Git Guardian. They've got a big report coming out this month. He's going to be there to demystify and clarify and all those wonderful things about secrets within public repos and beyond. That's my understanding. So, save the date is what we're saying there. Okay.
And on
We'll
that
wrap
note,
up.
I guess we should say goodbye.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending now and in the future. Like and subscribe and all that stuff, and we'll see you in London in the near future.
See you soon.
See
Thanks,
ya.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.